When looking at battles that occurred during imperial conflicts, well, they tend to be quite one-sided. Turns out when you have more resources and better technologies than your opponents, well, you tend to win. However, this isn't universally true. What you do find quite frequently, frankly, are underdog stories, when little guy with on paper worse technologies and certainly less resources, well, goes ahead and achieves the victory against all odds. There are plenty of examples of this throughout history. For one, at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, the Roman Empire would skill issue 3 full legions, 6 auxiliary cohorts and 3 cavalry squadrons, while coming up against the local Germanic tribes. This battle has been studied quite a bit, so for the sake of time we won't get into it, but to simplify, the invading Romans did not do sufficient scouting, did not spot the enemy in time, and frankly were completely unprepared for battle when it did start. And of course were completely unprepared for the local terrain as well, which in this case was a muddy forest hindering their maneuverability. That's all being said, and that's a lot of words for the guy in charge messed up, as functionally all of this can be summarized as a mistake by the general of the invading force. To give a completely different example though, we can look at the Battle of Little Bighorn, where the US Army did not do sufficient scouting, did not spot the enemy in time, were completely unprepared for the battle when it happened, and were also in the process positioned really badly in the enemy terrain, which can all be attributed to failure in leadership. I mean, I can keep going. The Battle of the Anul, the Battle of Kuralaba, or the Battle of Mactan. History is full of commanders making really stupid decisions that are stupid in hindsight and stupid in present, leading to underdog victories. And the honest reality, though, is that a lot of the time for the underdog to pull ahead and secure a win, you kind of need the invading power to make these major mistakes. But what if the invading force, say a hypothetical British Empire, near the very peak of Pax Britannica indeed, didn't make any stupid mistakes? What if they would attack you with overwhelming force, bring the newest and bestest equipment available, adequately scout you out, not fall for any classical ambushes, pick good terrain even against you, and keep their troops adequately supplied the whole time? Can you still beat that? Well, if you're the Zulu, the answer might just be yes. So let's go find out how they did it. Around 4,000 years ago, within Central Africa, the Bantu migrations began. These migrations are a topic of study in their own right, but what matters for us today is quite literally the final phase of these migrations, as by around the year 300, the Nguni people would migrate into an area today known as KwaZulu-Natal, among which at the time the minor clan of the Zulu could be found. I bring this up because usually when we think of tribesmen migrating across Africa, we tend to think of it happening in quite literally caveman times, but this was finished in 300 AD, which, for context, was around the time Diocletian had just wrapped up a successful campaign into Persia, sacking the then capital Ctesiphon, after putting an end to that whole crisis of the 3rd century. Either way, let's get back to the Zulu and let's jump forward a bit, quite a bit actually, to 1787. And like all good stories, we'll start with an affair. Nandi, the daughter of one of the Mlongo chiefs, had an out-of-marriage dalliance with the son of the then Zulu king Senzangakona. This is probably a good time to say that I'm trying my best with pronunciation, but words are hard. Either way, the resulting pregnancy was a bit of an issue for Nandi, who decided to solve this problem once and for all with a flawless plan. She would conceal her pregnancy by saying it wasn't a pregnancy, no, it was an intestinal beetle, don't worry about it. This was a flawless plan that had 0 flaws and indeed would work flawlessly for 9 months before she gave birth to a boy. What I can only assume to be a consequence of this genius flawless plan, the boy would be named quite literally intestinal beetle, which in Zulu is Shaka. Now Shaka is an individual that is worthy of an exploration all of his own, and the stories of his rise to power and exploits are frankly a topic that cannot be done justice in a section of a YouTube video. What I will say though is that under him, he will not only usurp his way into power over his mother's tribe, but also take over the Zulu, claiming that as his primary title through succession from his father. This power base would then be used to expand the kingdom of the Zulu into a true regional power, uniting the many tribes under him. And while it is true that the majority of this expansion was achieved through warfare, he would also build a system of patronage not unlike those seen in early feudal Europe, using which he would bring in tribes such as the Mkhize, the Sithole, and the Suli, tribes which never fought against the Zulu, yet tribes that nevertheless would get integrated into his domain. But what I wish to focus upon today are going to be his military reforms. Firstly, in terms of equipment, he would pioneer a short stabbing spear, the Ikla. See, before Shaka, the Zulu as well as the vast majority of their opponents were armed with long throwing spears, the Assegai, which Shaka did keep but greatly reduced reliance upon. The shorter stabbing spear was built with melee combat specifically in mind, which gave Shaka a lot of his military success. To quote the Zulu scholar John Laband, this gave him a terrifying advantage over his opponents who clung to the traditional practice of throwing their spears and avoiding hand-to-hand conflict, because tribal warfare pre-Shaka involved the two tribes meeting up, throwing spears at each other and then usually calling it there and going home, if one of the sides didn't win from the exchange. What is disputed is the invention of the Ikla spear itself, credit being assigned anywhere from other individuals around Shaka to him copying the British after hearing that their success were due to bayonets. But what isn't disputed is Shaka's adoption and promotion of the weapon. Shaka would also introduce a larger, heavier shield, which further helped in melee combat, Shaka would train his troops to run up to the enemy, use the larger shield to hook the enemy's shield out to the right, and then stab away. This proved to be very successful, but of course Shaka wouldn't stop there. The next step of his reforms involved Shaka drilling his army to the point of frankly absurdity. Sources vary as always, and to be honest, with most things I talk about already, I'm talking about the most accepted facts. Like everything I've said so far has had at least one historian disputing it. Remember the migrations from the very start? Yeah, they are widely accepted, but look, here's a quote from a historian disputing them. Anyway, Shaka would train his troops to run barefoot over rough terrain to toughen the feet of his warriors. This was not a popular move, but Shaka would solve this issue by simply killing the people that refused. Which, fair enough, guess that works. His relentless drill would also include forced marches of over 80 kilometers or 50 miles a day barefoot over hot rocky terrain. Another aspect of Shaka's reforms was his frankly fanatical military discipline. He would achieve this naturally by being exceptionally brutal to his warriors, a brutality that involved, among other things, executing soldiers that showed hesitation. But disciplines through sheer brutality and some new equipment were in some way secondary to Shaka's main reform, the infamous bullhorn formation. Innovating on the previous military tactic of stand in a line, throw javelin, and then go home, the bullhorn would split any force into three parts: a chest composed of the veterans that would act as the main force, charging into the enemy unit, engage them in melee and keep them pinned in place. Then you had the younger, faster warriors on the horns. Their purpose was to flank and encircle the enemy, enveloping them and destroying them once encircled. And behind all of this were the loins, a large reserve ready to reinforce where necessary, deployed to where the enemy was about to break out of the initial encirclement, and would also engage with the chest if necessary. Now, some criticism of these reforms would point out that by the point that Shaka was doing this was absolutely nothing new. He could have come up with this by reading a Western military textbook. My counter to that is we know he definitely didn't read a Western military textbook because he couldn't read. We know this as at one point a Westerner had arrived at Shaka's court and attempted to introduce them to the concept of literacy, and show them the benefits of writing things down. Upon hearing out of this advanced technology, Shaka would dismiss them, saying that his messengers, if they lied, would be killed. This means that his messengers didn't lie, so writing things down is pointless. Damn, we're getting literacy rates to 0 with that one. Anyway, another new technology that was shown to Shaka was of course the gun, as Europeans were actually very interested in selling them guns. Shaka would actually be very impressed with the guns, but would note they would take so long to reload that his warriors could run up and stab the person with the gun, meaning that the guns were bad actually and he's not interested in buying them. These reforms aside, Shaka would retire and live out the rest of his life peacefully. And what I mean by retire and live out the rest of his life peacefully is at the ripe old age of 41, he'll be stabbed to death by his half-brothers, with the eldest, Dingane, taking the Zulu throne. Now you might be thinking being murdered by siblings would have been shocking to Shaka, a betrayal perhaps, but fun fact, they actually tried to kill him twice before this and failed, so third time's the charm, I guess. Now technically this did immediately lead to a bunch of tribes revolting against Dingane, but to be fully honest, they were revolting before, and during, and after. In fact, the reason the assassination worked at all was because a large part of Shaka's army was busy crushing a tribal uprising. But this did mean that this very decentralized, barely held together state with huge in practice autonomy for Shaka's former subjects would survive this succession, and many others after Shaka, as subsequent rulers would secure the loyalty of the Impi and hence continuity in one form or another of the Zulu state. Regardless, Shaka would leave the Zulus with a standing army of 50,000 Impi, which is a really impressive figure because for one, this isn't a hypothetical maximum strength. This figure comes from the Impi currently in operation at the time of his death, all levied from a population estimated to be between 250 and 260,000, meaning Shaka would boast a ridiculously impressive militarization factor of 1 in 5 people, or just under 20% if you take the 260k population figure. This is insane, especially considering this is 1828. This is just under 20% ratio deployed in a society built for war. To give an example from Europe, Prussia, the army with a state under Frederick the Great, would field at its peak a 1 in 28 men army. During the same conflict, what was Britain fielding? 1 in 320, although Britain was more militarized than that figure would suggest, as this 1 in 320 applied to the whole empire. Yeah, the absurdity of this militarization is actually seen more by the fact that following Shaka's death, the subsequent Zulu kings would actually greatly diminish their standing forces and frankly demilitarize, all while still fighting constant internal civil wars or tribal uprisings or whatever term you'd prefer. Regardless, the Zulu would survive succession and other successions from that point onwards, cementing Shaka's legacy as a great founder. So while all of this is happening, what were the British up to? Well, in 1867, the United Kingdom passed the British North America Act, which led to the creation of the Dominion of Canada. Now you may be asking, what does this have to do with South Africa? And that's a great question. But you see, in 1877, Sir Henry Bartle Frere was really inspired by this British North America Act that happened over 10 years ago. Anyway, you see, it was so inspirational, and he was so inspired, he sent an ultimatum to the Zulu to surrender all of their weapons and formally join His Majesty's government as subjects of the empire. Now, here there are a couple things I must unfortunately point out. Firstly, while it is fine to say be inspired by Canada achieving Dominion status and using that achievement to strive for Dominion status while within South Africa, my question is, are the Zulus stopping Britain granting Dominion status to South Africa? Because the implementation of this line of reasoning is that the Zulu, which lived outside of Britain, and not just Britain, outside of South Africa, were somehow stopping Britain from granting South Africa Dominion status. Now, when I put it this way, it may sound wrong, but actually we know it's wrong, because we know the Zulu were not stopping Britain from granting Dominion status to South Africa. How do we know this? Well, because in 1910, Britain would grant Dominion status to South Africa, and it would do so while the Zulu were still there. Now, remarkably, this may seem already a bit insane, but it actually gets worse when you realise that the British got on with Shaka and subsequent Zulu governments. See, Shaka actually fell ill one day when visiting a British trade post and was treated by a European doctor. He recovered, which led to cordial relations between the two powers. In some ways, one of Shaka's diplomatic genius maneuvers was getting along with the British, a policy that would continue to be followed by Shaka's successors. It's through this, I won't say alliance, but frankly non-aggression pact at the very least, that the Europeans were able to do things like offer guns to sell to Shaka from previous examples, but also conduct missionary work. Put simply, before this ultimatum, the British and the Zulu got along. So the question was, why did the British Empire randomly issue an ultimatum that was clearly going to be rejected just as a pretext for war? The answer, naturally, was that the British Empire didn't issue this ultimatum. Bartle Frere issued the ultimatum, himself. In fact, he actually asked London if it could issue the ultimatum, and London said, and I paraphrase, "No, what? Don't do that." After which Bartle Frere, of course, became a loyal servant of the British Empire and did it anyway. Now again, you may be asking, what authority did he do this? And the answer is, he does what he wants, because a year before doing this, he would, and I am not kidding here, overthrow the first democratically elected government of South Africa, after which he would proclaim himself, and I quote again, as the prime authority, which is a very British way of saying, I'm in charge now. To the surprise of absolutely no one, the ultimatum was rejected and provoked a previous non-belligerent power to start mobilizing. Frere decides to solve this problem by deploying overwhelming force. Rather convenient, in fact, for whatever reason, Frere was actually expecting them to reject the ultimatum, so already started planning out the invasion by the time he sent out the message. Funny how that happens. Right then, for the campaign itself, Frere appoints Lord Chelmsford to deal with the whole situation, and right away we have a competent individual in charge of the whole thing. His military career started in the Crimean War, where he served with distinction and earned multiple commendations for his service, before in 1857 being deployed to India, where he was instrumental in, and I quote again, resolving an Indian rebellion. Wow, what a phrase. Anyway, in both cases he would serve with distinction, and it would be here in India that he would meet and befriend Bartle Frere. Now, I may be wondering what Frere was doing in India, but at this point Frere was serving as the governor of Bombay. I wonder how he ended up in South Africa later. I'm sure it's unrelated. Either way, you would think that fighting in the Crimean War and in India would mean he was good enough, but no, he went the extra mile for his work experience, because before South Africa, he took part in the 1868 expedition to Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, so on top of all of his previous military experience, he also had specific knowledge of fighting and campaigning within Africa as well. It's incredible, it was almost rigged in his favour, he had the perfect resume for all of this. So the commander, I hope you would agree, was good. Well, what about the men and their equipment? Maybe he just had low-quality troops to work with after all. No, he did not. The deployment consisted of British regulars, and while there was a contingent of local allies tasked with aiding Lord Chelmsford's forces, the main bulk of the troops were British regulars. As an example, you had among them the South Wales Borderers, which granted weren't called that at this point. They were called the 24th Regiment of Foot, which is a much less impressive name, but nevertheless this is a regiment that had military experience fighting against the French during the 7 Years' War, and then with the French against the Russians in the Crimean War. In total, there were 12 regular infantry companies deployed there, and these were considered battle-hardened and reliable troops. Perhaps then the issue lay in the equipment, or maybe even in supplying provisions to these soldiers. After all the experience in the world isn't helpful if you don't have any weapons or, say, run out of water. But here again, no, at no point during the whole exercise would the British run into any supply issues. Moreover, regarding equipment, the British had just upgraded to the Martin Henry breech-loading rifle. Indeed, the upgrade was so recent that most units in the British Army had not switched over their equipment yet, and the troops deployed to fight here had access to this brand new bestest kit. The rifle in question was the first purpose-built breech-loader in British military service. In fact, as while the previous Snyder Enfield rifle could breech-load, it wasn't designed with breech-loading initially and was modified to do so. This gave the Martin Henry breech-loading rifle both a superior fire rate as well as, frankly, greatly increased range. This is like in Civ when you have an army of, say, musketmen, and then you have to fight barbarians to upgrade the unit fighting the barbarians to riflemen, and then do the rest of the army later. Anyway, not only did they have the newest guns, they would also arrive on the battlefield with not one, but two 7-pound mountain guns. That is to say, they bought field artillery for this, as well as, and I'm not kidding, bringing in a Hale rocket battery. They brought an experimental rocket launcher to this conflict, and to be clear, just really to make sure we're on the same page here, they're fighting spearmen. To put it in a British way, and to quote another historian who was studying the event, the Zulus had a disadvantage in weapons technology, because forget bringing a gun to a knife fight, they brought a rocket launcher to a spear fight. But with that all said, Chelmsford begins the invasion. He has time pressure, he needs to get the whole thing wrapped up before London has learned there's even a war, in case they recall him or interfere. They are really keen to avoid long-term conflict. Ideally, they provoke the Zulu into a pitched battle, win, declare a victory, and formally subjugate the Zulus and then get to go home, before London catches up to their scheming. The worst outcome would be to march an army around and then spend decades stuck in a guerrilla conflict with the locals. They want pitched battles, ideally. As such, they move quickly, but not too quickly. They are scouting, but they split up their forces rather aggressively, attempting to find a Zulu army they can defeat. But again, though, they have done their homework. The invasion begins in January, which is right during the local harvest season. They know the Zulus are a warrior culture, but they also know their armies are in essence a levy force. At times of peace, they go back to work the fields. By forcing a levy mid-harvest season, the Zulus must make an uncomfortable choice. The more men that take up the call to arms, the more crops can't be harvested, and hence wither and die. The plan is, even if there was a full draft, some will stay behind to look after the farms to preserve at least some of the harvest, and this naturally will, against a full mobilization, reduce the Zulu troops. And at this point I will say, this is an obscene level of preparation, and to some extent it does pay off. The Impi had already travelled to the capital for the first fruit harvest festival, but following Cetshwayo's, the then king of the Zulus, mobilization, he is able to muster just 24,000 Impi. This is an impressive mobilization order still, given the population of 250k to 260k remaining mostly unchanged, but it's nowhere near Shaka's estimations of 50,000. Importantly though for the British, the Zulu force marches out, seeking a pitched battle, information confirmed to the British with their scouts. So far, all is going to plan. The first sign, or dare I even say indication of something not going entirely to plan though, is the speed of the Zulu deployments. The British advance into Zulu territory for sure, but they're doing so at a relatively reserved pace despite the urgency. Chelmsford, being a veteran of many colonial campaigns, is significantly prioritizing his supply lines over speed, ensuring that he can keep his men fed and supplied in the field. The Zulus do have a home terrain advantage for sure, alleviating some supply concerns for them, but even with that said, the speed of the Zulu deployments compared to the British is already staggering. By the 20th of January, the British, who have been on campaign for 10 days, have advanced 16 kilometers or 9.9 miles. The Zulu, who had finished mobilization and had only 5 days to maneuver, had already crossed 80 kilometers or 50 miles. Still, if the Zulu were to come to the British and lose their pitched battle, this would only be a good thing, as it would mean less supplies and hence costs would be expended on this whole operation. The British would continue with what I can only presume to be unbridled optimism. Now, the British were worried about an ambush. One of the reasons as to why they were advancing so slowly was they were really actively scouting after all. As such, when on the 20th of January Chelmsford arrived at what could only be described as an ideal spot from a conventional military standpoint, he was set up a more permanent camp. The sheer rock face of the local mountain, Isandlwana, would provide a secure flank and was for all practical purposes uncrossable. Around them, broad open plains gave them a clean view of their surroundings, thwarting attempts at conventional ambushes by hiding in forests or hills. Indeed, arguably a perfect place for camp, which is exactly what the British did, setting up shop at Isandlwana. Now, the British were doing their scouting, but so were the Zulu, and upon seeing a lot of the Zulu vanguards out and about, without also being able to spot a main force, Chelmsford was concerned the Zulus were avoiding a pitched battle, and so would split his troops, leaving half to defend the camp, and with the other half to pursue the Zulu and hopefully force an engagement. Chelmsford, in doing so, also realised that he could leave his camp vulnerable, so ordered Lieutenant Colonel Anthony William Dunford to move in with his garrison from Rorike Drift, a nearby British trade station. He would then leave Henry Pulleine with explicit orders to defend the camp and wait for reinforcements. And we know these explicit orders because he was British, so he wrote the orders in English. That is to say, the order was defend the camp and wait for reinforcements verbatim. Henry Pulleine would go ahead and do this, and by the evening of the 20th of January, Chelmsford would leave camp with around half the British soldiers following him, attempting to provoke an engagement with the Zulu. So what were the Zulus up to? The honest answer was they were advancing rapidly to meet the British in a pitched battle. By the morning of the 21st of January, the main Zulu force of 20,000 Impi from the total deployment of 24,000 arrived and hid in a nearby valley. The plan was to attack the British camp, which was 7 miles or 11 kilometers away from the valley in question. However, around the time the Zulus were setting up, reinforcements from Anthony Dunford had arrived. This created a problem. Anthony Dunford did outrank Henry Pulleine, and hence conventionally would have taken over command. However, Anthony Dunford also expressed his desire to keep the whole war thing going and abandon camp, marching further into Zulu territory and attempting to provoke a battle. Henry Pulleine would reject these orders as well as the convention of him being relieved of office, citing his explicit orders to defend the camp. Tension was high, at least one of the people here had just committed high treason, but they were British officers in the late 19th century, so I'm not kidding, they sat down had lunch, drank some tea, and talked through their disagreements. Wow, life is truly beyond parody. Following these discussions, it was then decided that the order given to Henry Pulleine was to defend the camp and wait for reinforcements. The order given to Anthony Dunford was to reinforce the camp. It was then argued that both orders were now fulfilled, but moving forward, Anthony Dunford, who upon arriving to the camp learnt of the British scouts reporting on a nearby force of 4,000 Zulus, would go out and pursue them, taking his reinforcement troops under his command. Meanwhile, Henry Pulleine would be left to defend the camp as per his orders, and everyone was happy. January 21st. The British scouting operations continue. Anthony Dunford is unable to locate the Zulu 4K contingency or force them into any kind of battle. After, for all intents and purposes, walking around in a circle for the better part of the day, he retreats back to within sight of Isandlwana camp. They know the Zulu are out there somewhere, but where is beyond them at the moment? Still, no ambushes or even losses have occurred. They've continued to maintain their provisions, and should the order from Chelmsford come through, they're happy to keep moving deeper into Zulu territory, pressing their apparent advantage. The 21st of January concludes uneventfully. Tensions are high, scouting operations continue from both sides, but no shots are fired. Not yet. January 22nd, British scouts from Camp Isandwana approach the valley the Zulus are hiding in, and there, at just over 8 am, the British scouts spot them. 20,000 impi sitting in silence, hiding in the shallow valley. The scouts themselves, though, are also spotted by the impi, who, upon seeing the scouts, rise and charge. The British respond to this with a disciplined fighting retreat, which is to say, they send one of their scouts to ride as fast back as possible back to camp to inform Henry Pulleine that he had found Zulu. Meanwhile, the others on horseback would be riding up ahead of the Zulu and shooting into them, presumably as an attempt to slow them down and inflict casualties best they can. From the Zulu perspective, they planned to attack the British camp on the 23rd, but upon their discovery on the 22nd, they were going to charge now. In the plains, in the open, all 20,000. A charge to an enemy position 7 miles or 11 kilometers away from camp. After just 2 hours, news of the Zulu imminent attack have reached Pulleine. The battle lines are drawn, and the British take up positions. The new Martin Henry rifles, with their increased rate of fire and greater range, were about to prove themselves very helpful, as the Zulus would be advancing over open plains with no cover. As for Dunford, he was close enough to the camp to move into position, but indeed he would bravely ride forward, meeting with earlier scouts that were partaking in their fighting retreat, and as the Zulu mass would continue their charge towards camp, Dunford's contingent would join the scouts in their fighting retreat, giving the British back at camp even more time to prepare and enter positions. The Zulus, meanwhile, even while charging, would enter formation, forming their famous horns and chest formation, but on a scale not seen before, the aim remaining to encircle and envelop the British position. The total length of this chest and horns would amount to a line of men 8 kilometers or 5 miles long, a formation they adopted even while under harassment fire from the British scouts and Dunford's reinforcement. And yet the left horn, nowhere to be seen. Regardless, at around 11 am that day, the Zulu would enter firing range from the British, and the British main force would open fire. These were disciplined troops, so they pelted volley after volley after volley into the Zulu lines, and yet the Zulu still kept on coming. The British field artillery would also open fire with devastating effect, killing dozens of Zulu spearmen by each shot. And yet the Zulu just kept advancing, charging the British lines. And the British, they stood there and would continue to unleash volley after volley into the Zulu formations. By midday, after a straight hour of firing, the Zulu chest was being pinged down. The British were able to shoot the Zulu with great aid from field artillery at about the rate the Zulu were advancing. However, the left flank was starting its envelopment, forcing Pulleine to redeploy some of his firepower to meet the Zulus there. Furthermore, at this point, Dunford's men, as well as the scouts, had been forced to retreat pretty much back to the camp. From there, Dunford would complete an organized and disciplined full retreat, straight back into the camp, rejoining their formations, in the process though exposing the British right flank even more to the envelopment. Still, while the Zulus were now making progress, each step of the progress would be met with British volley after volley, who at this point were entering the second hour of continuous fire. And then they entered the third hour. It would also be here that the left horn would be revealed. It was 4,000 Zulus that had been spotted earlier who re-emerged and joined the envelopment maneuver, meaning Pulleine had to redeploy even more firepower to focus on those new arrivals. Still, the British would stand holding the line. Despite these continued volleys and continued artillery fire, the Zulu would just keep coming. They just got closer, and in an act that can only be described as poetry, at 2:30 p.m, hour 3.5 of the fighting, there was an eclipse. The Zulu were not quite in melee range, but they were getting awfully close, and the British, having been firing non-stop volleys into the Zulu line for half of a full workday at this point, were surely getting tired. Eventually though, something, somewhere, had to give. That something was the British, as by 3 p.m, 4 hours after the first shots were fired from the main camp, the Zulu had finally reached the British lines within a full envelopment and entered melee. The British had their bayonets, and what in short could only be described as a glorious last stand. Initial historians and records of the engagement simply stated that the Zulu reached the British lines and the battle ended there, but more modern analysis, which looked at the distribution of British corpses, would show a rather glorious last stand, as the very experienced British troops would form makeshift Spanish squares and fight to the very end. Furthermore, the mounted contingents of the British colonial forces, who could have easily escaped, most certainly chose not to. They would fight to the very end, a testimony to the veterancy and discipline of the British army for sure, but some did survive. Not the wounded, there was no quarter given to the British after all. So who survived? Well, 3 days prior, the King of the Zulu gave his men the following order: march slowly, attack at dawn, and eat up the Red soldiers. Which is rather ironic, but yes, compared to Shaka's impressive 80 kilometers or 50 miles per day forced marches, the 80 kilometers or 50 miles in 5 days advance was by Zulu standards considered a slow march. They did attack at dawn in fairness, just not on the day they planned, and indeed, mass slaughtered the Red soldiers as instructed. But here was the key: the Zulu were following orders. They attacked the soldiers in red uniforms, the British Redcoats, and would carry out these orders with straight up 100% effectiveness, because not a single soldier or officer who wore a red uniform that day would survive to tell the tale, and this included both Dunford and Pulleine, who would die among their men that day. The only survivors were those that wore the blue uniforms of the British native auxiliaries, and some of the British scouts who were also naturally not attempting to scout the enemy in bright red uniforms. It was their survival that helps us know of the events of the battle in greater detail. But what about Chelmsford and his contingent? Well, as it turns out, he was sent multiple messages to return, although in many cases he was simply too far away from the camp for this to matter. Regardless, those messages came in increasing degrees of urgency. The last one would read as follows: "For God's sake, come back, the camp is surrounded and things I fear are going badly," which was sent at 2:15 PM, so for context, "I fear are going badly" translates to "We've been shooting at them non-stop for the last 3 hours and 15 minutes, but they're still coming." Now, this message was finally taken seriously and would let Chelmsford return back to camp at 4 PM, half an hour after the battle ended, by which point the Zulus had already left. The first reaction from Chelmsford upon his return was to say, "But I left over 1,000 men to guard the camp." It was considered unthinkable, after all, that with all of his provisions and backups and reinforcement, that this could be possible. Fearing he would demoralize his men even further, he would stay at the remnants of the camp very briefly before setting back from Zulu-controlled lands. The Zulu, meanwhile, would attempt an assault with their remaining 4,000 men on the Roca trade station mentioned earlier, with the last 150 British men of the garrison would mount a heroic defense. That was actually successful. Nevertheless, a truth here was self-evident, and the only mistake that can truly be pointed to today is that Chelmsford should have entrenched his camp more properly. Which is fair in hindsight, but my counter to that claim is that he was already taking a lot of defensive precautions, and we must remember he's on the offensive here and already advancing rather slowly. Time is not on his side. He needs to wrap up this whole conflict before London stops him after all, and spending, in his own words, a week to entrench of course makes sense in hindsight, but I would also argue it would be incorrect to make assumptions like the Zulu will charge over 7 miles on foot, and the Zulu would sustain over 4 hours of fire, not break, and overwhelm such a large British force. Later historians and military analysts would study the battle. Further excuses were given, for example at one point claiming the British ran out of ammunition. Now the remnants of the camp actually showed plenty of ammunition boxes. Chelmsford did keep his men well supplied, so the excuse was that the British men couldn't open the new screw-topped boxes in time, claiming they were screwed on too tightly. No, I'm not joking. I will say though, to be clear, modern historians have largely rejected this claim. The fault can be attributed in many ways to Chelmsford perhaps needing to commit even more to scouting the enemy, or advancing even slower than he already was, but the failure, if anything, was more so a grand strategy failure. The war itself is one they should not have taken part in. It is important to realize that in many ways the British would make a lot of excuses over time, like the ammunition boxes being screwed on too tightly, to diminish the achievements of the Zulu. It is rather embarrassing to praise what would be considered natives with spears after all, especially since it was their superior positioning, maneuverability, deployment, and frankly even discipline, which was their key to victory. So what happened afterwards? Well, the population of South Africa naturally grew very worried that the Zulu would keep pushing and conquer British settlements, so a lot of citizens started building makeshift defences and stockpiling weapons. Frere would very publicly encourage this, claiming that the Zulu would invade any minute now. While the Zulu certainly could have acted here and done an invasion, the Zulu king Cetshwayo would prohibit crossing the border, and desperately kept attempting to enter negotiations with the British, repeatedly seeking a peace deal, a truce, anything. The problem though for Frere was, following the invasion being crushed, news would reach London, and this was especially an issue since London prohibited the war earlier. This meant that back at home the English people were outraged about this unjust invasion of a foreign sovereign nation, and wished to avoid the repeat of all those unnecessary casualties, and I'm just kidding, it's the late 19th century. The public sentiment in Britain was a practically universal call for revenge. But let's put ourselves in the London government's shoes. To summarise the problem, Frere arrives in South Africa. He decides the Zulus are an issue and hence needs to solve the issue, so he deploys overwhelming force. This doesn't work, and he gets a lot of British troops killed. This matter has now reached you in London. What do? Well, London's decision was, okay, the Zulus are an issue, and hence we need to solve the issue with overwhelming force. This time though, they deploy 160,000 men to fix the problem permanently. Yeah, there will be no second close battles, nothing even remotely mentionable of interest for the second campaign. The British show up and just achieve an overwhelming victory against the Zulu. But as Ulundi, the capital, falls after a frankly ceremonial siege, and what I mean by ceremonial siege is that Ulundi falls after 45 minutes. Yeah, it just wasn't fair. Following up this very unfair victory, the British turn around and declare that, okay, we've won now, why are we here again? Does anyone remember why are we here again? So now, after winning, the British sue for peace. They formally declare that the Zulu must no longer have a central king and go back to being ruled by their individual chiefs of each tribe. Considering the current king was in British custody and frankly was barely holding on to power as is, given the constant civil wars, the Zulus were very happy to accept these terms. The British, meanwhile, having declared victory, didn't even take any land or demand any monetary tribute. They were done. They took the Zulu king Seshwayo as prisoner, took him back to London, and just went home. So, what happened after that campaign? Well, after the British army had left South Africa, one of the local Zulu chiefs, Zibhebu, would declare himself king of the Zulu and reunify most of the tribes back under his command. In less than a year. This was in strict violation of the one and only term of the treaty, but no one could be bothered to do anything about it, so nothing happened. 2 years after the British declared their victory, they would also remember, oh right, we captured the old king, he's in London, what do we do with him? So they just let him go. Yeah, no, they transported him back to South Africa in 1883 and just sent him home. Now, his arrival back to the Zulu lands would lead to his immediate claiming of the throne, and the Zulus would go straight into a civil war. But that one wasn't as bad as it could be, as Shetwayo would die of a heart attack in 1884. Now, some would claim he was poisoned, but we don't have a lot of sources, as the other Zulu king would formally go with the heart attack story, and the British frankly didn't care enough to investigate. The relations of the Zulu to each other and back to Britain returned to normalcy, which is to say the Zulu went back to their constant infighting and civil wars, and eventually the Zulu would be incorporated as a Bantustan, or basically a native reservation, into South Africa. To this day, the Zulu still exists within KwaZulu-Natal in a semi-autonomous state. But finally, let's finish this video by talking about Bartle Frere, the man that started the whole ordeal. As the British army went home back in 1881, they picked him up as well and dragged him back to London. There he was formally censured, which is a polite way of saying told off and kicked out of all political power, for starting a war with the Zulu, but also for starting a war with Afghanistan. And you may be wondering, how did he manage to start a war with Afghanistan? Well, he did that back when he was governor of Bombay. The only reason he was in South Africa in the first place was because he was demoted from his governorship of Bombay because of that illegal invasion of Afghanistan. And hence the thinking went, well, he wouldn't be able to invade Afghanistan from South Africa now, would he? But I guess he found the next best thing. At this point though, after I guess starting 2 illegal wars, and also he did start the Boer War, that was him, the British Prime Minister at the time, Gladstone, finally filed misconduct charges against him, and in 1884, Bartle Frere began preparation for his legal defence. It would have gone to court if it wasn't for a slight hiccup, namely that in 1884, Bartle Frere would pass away from old age. He was 69 at that point after all. Given the circumstances of his withdrawal from office, he would also be stripped of his titles and have his lordship revoked. Just kidding, it's the 19th century, he was a British colonial governor. Upon his death, what actually happened was all charges were dropped and he was given a state burial in St. Paul's Cathedral, alongside Horatio Nelson and the Duke of Wellington, no less. His formal praise and commendation did not end there. Of course, his titles were untouched, but posthumously he would be given a lot of awards. For one, he was appointed as the first honorary president of the Royal Society of South Africa. Remember him invading Afghanistan? Well, the capital of Sindh, Karachi, the largest city in Pakistan and the 12th largest city in the world, would name a road, a street, and even a whole town within Karachi after Frere. They also built Frere Hall in Karachi to commemorate him. In 1884, 4 years after his death, the Prince of Wales would unveil a statue of him at Thames Embankment, a statue that stands to this day, which you can go visit if you're around the area. It's straight up within sight of Big Ben and the House of Parliament and the London Eye, like real prime real estate. Now, remember how he was appointed as governor in Australia? No? That's because he wasn't, but they didn't stop Mount Bartle Frere, the highest mountain in Queensland, Australia, from being named after him. And since we're talking about Queensland, one of their fancy public schools also named a boarding house after him. Going to South Africa now, there's a road in Johannesburg named in his honour, Frere Road, and Durban, the third largest city in South Africa, there's actually 2 roads there that honour him, Frere Road and Bartle Road. Moving on to Kenya, of all places, a place where he never even visited, well, they would go ahead and name a whole district of the capital Mombasa, Frere Town, after him. And I guess just for fun, they would also name Mount Frere, another mountain, after him as well. That's a lot of honours, but somehow it doesn't stop here. The botanist N.A. Dalzell would name a whole plant genus he discovered in Frere's honour, the Frere, meaning that on top of everything else, he doesn't just get a mention in certain biology textbooks, he gets a whole chapter. So, is there a lesson to all of this? I mean, for sure there are lessons, but I don't think there are many lessons you would want people to learn from this story, as the main takeaways seem 1. You can just start colonial conflicts, or 2. You can solve your problems by deploying more troops, and even 3. If your movement speed and troop count exceeds enemy fire rate, it's a good idea to charge into them, which apparently was a very popular lesson for World War I generals, although one could argue they might have probably overestimated the running speed of their own troops. Well, if you do insist on learning a lesson here today though, consider that the British are perhaps not the best at naming things. Reasons aside, 2 mountains and multiple roads being called Frere is probably a bad idea from a confusion point of view. But that's not always true. Sometimes the British are great at naming things. So great, in fact, they can accidentally solve long-standing philosophical paradoxes. And if that story is something that interests you, well, you can learn about that by clicking this video here.